Imagine a winter night so quiet that even the mountains seem to stop breathing. Snow falls thick over a small town called White Rock Ridge, and a lone police officer drives through the storm, thinking the road is empty and the night is silent. But somewhere beneath the snow, a weak cry is waiting to be heard, and the choice he makes in the next few minutes will change not only his life, but the fate of two fragile souls. Before this story begins, I want to know where you are watching from right now. Please leave your city or country in the comments so I can greet you. And if you believe stories of hope and loyalty still matter, please press subscribe to support the channel and walk with us through this winter miracle. White Rock Ridge was barely more than a name on a weather map, a small mountain town pressed between pine-covered slopes and winding cliff roads that vanished each winter under layers of drifting snow. In summer, it smelled of resin and wet stone, but in winter, it belonged to silence, ice, and the long howl of wind moving through empty ravines. On this night, the storm arrived without mercy. Snow fell in thick, violent sheets, erasing road lines, swallowing guardrails, and turning the familiar mountain pass into a blind corridor of white. The temperature had dropped hard after sunset, and even the streetlights near the old rest area flickered like tired sentinels fighting the cold. Ethan Cole drove alone through that storm, the county patrol truck crawling forward as if resisting every inch. He was 34 years old, tall with broad shoulders shaped by years of physical work and quiet endurance. His dark brown hair was cut short in regulation style, already dusted with melting snow from earlier stops, and faint lines had settled permanently around his eyes from squinting into headlights and winter glare. His face carried a restrained weariness, the kind that came not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much memory without release. 3 years ago, his wife had died in a highway collision on black ice, and since then, Ethan had turned inward. He spoke little at work unless duty required it, volunteered for the late shifts no one wanted, and chose isolation not because he disliked people, but because grief had made human conversation feel unbearably loud. The storm alerts blinking across his dashboard reflected in his eyes as he radioed dispatch, his voice calm and professional even as the mountain tightened around him. The road closures were starting higher up the ridge, and Ethan's job was to check the last few stopping points before the pass became officially impassable. He eased the truck into the deserted rest area near mile marker 27, a place that once served tourists in summer but stood abandoned in winter except for drifting snow and the occasional stranded vehicle. The wind slammed against his door as he stepped out, instantly cutting through his uniform and gloves, numbing his fingers within seconds. His boots crunched through uneven layers of fresh and compacted snow as he moved methodically from one end of the lot to the other, shining his flashlight beneath benches, around trash bins, and along the edges where cars sometimes slid off and vanished under white drifts. It was during that sweep, beside an old metal dumpster half buried in snow, that he heard it. At first, it sounded like wind trapped in metal, a thin vibration barely different from the storm itself. But then it rose again, weaker and sharper, unmistakably a living sound. A whimper, a cry so faint it might have been imagined by a man already exhausted by cold and loneliness. Ethan knelt, brushing snow aside with his gloved hands until his flashlight beam caught the corner of an old wooden crate wedged against the base of the dumpster. The boards were split with age, the lid crooked, and a piece of torn blue tarp had been draped loosely over the top. Beneath that makeshift shelter, pressed together in trembling knots of fur and bone, were 2 German shepherd puppies, no more than 7 weeks old. Their coats were thick for their age, but soaked through with melted snow, their ribs faintly visible beneath wet black and tan fur. One was slightly larger, with a darker muzzle and heavy-lidded eyes that blinked slowly in confusion and pain. The other was smaller, leaner, its ears not yet fully standing, its body shivering uncontrollably as it tried weakly to push itself upright. Their breathing was shallow and uneven, and the straw beneath them was damp, except for one small corner where the tarp had barely deflected the wind. They were alive only by accident and stubborn biology. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. He had seen accident scenes that twisted metal and flesh together beyond recognition, had held hands that cooled beneath his palms, but the fragile helplessness of these 2 small lives struck somewhere deeper. He lifted them carefully, one at a time, cradling their limp bodies against his chest, feeling their hearts flutter against his own. He pulled off his heavy patrol coat, wrapping it around them both, despite the sting of exposed cold against his uniform. Back in the truck, he blasted the heater to full, placed the puppies on the passenger seat, and cupped his hands near their bodies to guide warm air toward them. The larger puppy managed a soft sound, not quite a bark, more a questioning breath. The smaller one pressed closer to its sibling, instinctively seeking warmth. Ethan radioed dispatch again, his voice tight but steady, reporting the find and requesting immediate veterinary support. The nearest emergency clinic was more than 40 minutes down the mountain in clear conditions. Tonight, with the storm accelerating and closures spreading, that distance might as well have been twice as long. Dispatch confirmed what he already feared. No rescue vehicle could safely reach him. The only viable option was to attempt a careful descent on his own, while the lower road remained partially open. Ethan turned the truck back toward the mountain pass, driving slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching across to steady the shaking bundles beside him. The storm thickened, visibility narrowing to a few struggling yards beyond the headlights. Snow struck the windshield like handfuls of thrown gravel, and wind shoved at the truck's frame as if testing its resolve. Then it happened, without warning. A massive pine, weakened by age and burdened by heavy snow, snapped somewhere above and toppled across the road in a sudden explosion of sound. Ethan slammed the brakes, the truck skidding sideways before stopping inches from the fallen trunk. The engine coughed once, twice, and died. He tried the ignition again and again, but the starter only clicked uselessly. The heater sputtered and fell silent, and the sudden absence of warmth was immediate and violent. The temperature inside the cabin dropped with alarming speed, frost creeping across the inside edges of the windows as Ethan's breath fogged the air. Radio static filled the cab in broken bursts, fragments of voices lost in interference. He tried to call for help, but the signal faded in and out, swallowed by distance and storm. Outside, snow began already to pile against the truck's tires, soft at first, then packing hard under relentless wind. Ethan glanced at the puppies. Their shaking had worsened, their tiny bodies losing the struggle against cold faster than his own. There was no waiting this out, not for him, and certainly not for them. He gathered what he could: an emergency thermal blanket from the trunk, a flashlight, a spare scarf. He wrapped the puppies together inside the reflective blanket, adding his scarf for extra insulation, and pressed them tightly against his chest beneath his uniform jacket. The heat of his body was now all they had. The old hiking trail he remembered from childhood cut through the trees downhill from this part of the road. It was risky, narrow, and half forgotten, but it led toward scattered cabins and small farms in the lower valley. Somewhere along that path, light might still exist. Ethan stepped into the storm with the mountain clawing at his face, snow slicing against his cheeks like knives of ice. Each step sank deep, his legs quickly numbing as he forced his way through rising drifts. The puppies shifted weakly inside the blanket, their combined weight a fragile burden he clung to with both arms as if carrying his own heartbeat. Minutes stretched into an endless blur of white and pain. His vision narrowed, darkness creeping at the edges. The wind screamed through the trees with the sound of an animal warning others away, just as his legs began to falter, and the idea of rest whispered dangerously in his mind. A dim yellow glow flickered through the snow ahead, a single point of warm color in the white void. The low rumble of an engine followed, hesitant but real. Ethan lifted his head, forcing one foot forward, then another, until the shape of an old blue pickup emerged from the storm, crawling uphill with stubborn determination. The headlights swept across his snow-covered form, and the truck slowed, tires crunching closer. The driver's side window rolled down, releasing a burst of warm air into the frozen night. The face behind the glass belonged to an older man, broad despite age, with a thick gray beard rimed with ice, eyes sharp beneath a wool cap pulled low. The mountain exhaled around them as the truck came to a stop, the storm pressing closer as if listening. The old blue pickup crept forward another few feet before stopping completely, its headlights cutting twin tunnels of yellow through the screaming white dark. Snow slapped against the hood and rattled across the windshield like handfuls of stones. yet the engine kept its low, steady growl, stubborn and patient. The driver leaned toward the open window, letting the bitter air rush inside without flinching. Samuel Brooks was 63 years old, broad across the chest, despite the slight forward curve of his shoulders. His strength no longer sharp, but compressed into something dense and enduring. His beard was thick and silvered unevenly by age and frost. His weathered face cut with old lines earned not from comfort, but from decades of sun, wind, and choices made under pressure. Beneath his wool cap, pale eyes studied the snowbound figure ahead with practiced calm. Samuel had once been a combat engineer and later a military K-9 handler, a man trained to read terrain, movement, and danger with equal care. After his son's death years earlier in a highway accident, not unlike the one that later took Ethan's wife, Samuel had retreated into the mountains, choosing a life measured by repairs, fuel levels, and silence rather than conversation. The sheriff's office still called on him sometimes during winter storms, because he knew every bend of these roads the way other men knew their own hands. Ethan staggered closer, boots dragging through knee-deep drifts as the last of his strength tightened around the two fragile bodies beneath his jacket. The wind tore at his breath, each inhale burning like broken glass. Samuel pushed the door open hard enough to crack ice from its edge and stepped out, his boots steady despite the slope. In the glare of the headlights, he took in Ethan's uniform, the frost clinging to his lashes, and the trembling bundle pressed to his chest. He moved without hesitation, gripping Ethan's arm with one solid hand to keep him upright. "Get in the truck, officer," Samuel said, his voice rough but controlled, shaped by command and years of giving orders when time mattered. "This mountain doesn't forgive people who linger." Ethan nodded, unable to waste breath on words, and allowed himself to be guided to the passenger side. Samuel swung the door open and helped him inside, the cab instantly swallowing them with heat and the thick smell of oil, old leather, and burning wood carried from the cabin stove earlier that evening. As the door shut, the puppies shifted weakly beneath Ethan's jacket, one giving a faint sound that was barely more than a breath. Samuel noticed at once. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in sharp focus. "You carrying something alive under there?" Ethan pulled his jacket open just enough to show the reflective thermal wrap inside, the dark shapes pressed together. The heater fan roared as Samuel cranked it higher, guiding the warm air toward them with a practiced motion. "German shepherd pups," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "Found them in a crate under the snow. About 7 weeks old, maybe younger." Samuel's jaw tightened for a moment, a flicker of something old passing through his eyes. He reached over without ceremony and adjusted the blanket so the warm airflow could reach the puppies directly. "They picked the wrong night to be born into," he muttered, "but maybe the right man found them." Samuel eased the truck forward again, nudging past the fallen pine, where another vehicle would have surrendered completely. He maneuvered with short, deliberate movements, tire chains biting into ice with a sound like grinding bone. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The road was too narrow, the storm too loud. Ethan's body shook now, not only from cold, but from the delayed trembling of adrenaline fading at last. He kept one hand cupped protectively over the puppies, feeling their faint warmth slowly returning. The smaller one stirred, its body twitching with weak defiance. The larger one remained still, eyes half open, observing the unfamiliar heat and vibration with quiet caution. Under the cab's dim light, their coats showed their promise even in misery. Thick black saddles, warm tan legs, the unmistakable markings of their breed still forming. To Ethan, they looked like fragments of courage wrapped in fur. It was not until the truck descended lower into the tree line, where the wind lost some of its violent force, that Samuel spoke again. "You're Cole," he said quietly, not as a question. Ethan turned his head in surprise. "Yes," he answered. "Ethan Cole, County Patrol." Samuel nodded once, eyes still on the road. "White Rock Ridge doesn't forget its boys. I remember your family. You were a skinny kid when you left town." Ethan studied the older man's profile in the shifting light, recognition stirring slowly. "You're Samuel Brooks," he said after a moment. "My mother used to buy firewood from you." Samuel's mouth twitched faintly at the memory. "That sounds like her?" Always said she could smell when winter was 2 weeks away. The mountain bent downward sharply ahead, and Samuel guided the truck into the descent with measured calm. Another mile passed before the outline of a small cabin appeared through the trees, its windows glowing amber against the snow. The structure leaned slightly with age, but smoke rose steadily from its chimney, strong and alive. Samuel steered off the road and into the narrow drive, the truck crunching to a stop beside a stacked wall of firewood glazed with ice. He climbed out first, the wind still fierce but softened by distance from the exposed pass. Ethan followed more slowly, his legs stiff, the puppies cradled against him as though he carried both fragile cargo and fragile truth. Inside the cabin, warmth rushed out as Samuel swung the door open, spilling light across the snow like a promise. The cabin was simple, but fiercely alive. Rough wooden walls held the scent of pine, smoke, and dried herbs. A cast-iron stove glowed red at the center of the room, radiating thick waves of heat. The space was arranged with the economy of a man used to living alone, but not carelessly. A heavy wooden table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with tools, lanterns, and neatly stacked canned food. The warmth wrapped around Ethan instantly, thawing pain back into his fingers with sharp needles of sensation. Samuel motioned him to the table. "Set them here." Ethan lowered the puppies carefully onto a folded wool blanket Samuel spread with quick, precise movements. He peeled away the thermal wrap and scarf, exposing their tiny, trembling bodies fully to the heat for the first time since they had been abandoned. Samuel moved with sudden intensity, drawing water into a small pot and placing it on the stove, retrieving dry towels from a cabinet, and preparing a makeshift heating pad from a hot water bottle he kept for his own winter aches. His hands were steady, practiced. Ethan watched, a dull realization settling into him that this older man had done this before, had held fragile lives at the edge of survival more times than he could count. When the water was warm enough, Samuel dampened a cloth and gently wiped ice and grime from the puppy's paws and faces. The smaller one twitched weakly and emitted a faint squeak that almost passed for a protest. "That one's got spirit," Samuel said softly. "Won't let go easily." The larger puppy lifted its head a fraction, dark eyes steady and thoughtful, even in exhaustion. "And that one," Samuel added, "watches the world like it's already learned how hard it can be." Ethan sat heavily in the nearest chair, his body finally surrendering to fatigue now that the emergency had loosened its grip. He watched the steam rise from the stove, the puppies' breathing slowly grow more even, their trembling easing degree by degree. The silence between him and Samuel was not awkward. It was simply 2 men listening to life return in fragile increments. When the puppies were finally wrapped in dry towels and laid beside the stove, Samuel poured 2 mugs of strong coffee and handed one to Ethan. The first sip burned down his throat and into his chest, anchoring him to the present in a way he had not felt in hours. For the first time that night, his hands stopped shaking. They talked quietly then, not of the storm or the road, but of what remained after loss. Ethan spoke in fragments about his wife, about how silence had followed her absence into every corner of his life. Samuel did not interrupt. When Ethan's words thinned into nothing, Samuel only nodded, as if acknowledging what could not be neatly answered. The puppies shifted again near the stove, one nosing blindly toward warmth, the other staying still as if guarding the boundary between sleep and alertness. Samuel watched them with a softened gaze that surprised Ethan. "Names," Samuel said after a while, his voice low. "They'll need names if they're going to live." Ethan hesitated. The larger puppy's steady eyes met his. "Ash," he said quietly, the word forming without conscious thought. "For what survives when everything else burns away?" The smaller one chose that moment to attempt a wobbly stand, legs uncoordinated yet determined, slipping once before pushing upright again, with a weak but unmistakable defiance. Samuel let out a rough breath that was almost a laugh. "Blaze," he said, "that one's a spark that doesn't know how to die." Ethan found himself smiling for the first time in weeks, the expression unfamiliar and fragile on his face, as if it belonged to another version of him he had not seen in years. Outside, the storm continued to rage across the mountain, but inside the small cabin at the edge of White Rock Ridge, 2 lives named themselves into the world, as the fire cracked softly in approval. Morning arrived at White Rock Ridge not with sunlight, but with a pale, muted silence that followed the storm like a held breath. The wind had softened into a low, restless whisper among the pines, and the sky hung heavy with layered gray clouds that promised more snow, but granted a fragile truce for now. The world beyond Samuel's cabin lay buried under fresh drifts, the night's violence smoothed into deceptive calm. Inside the cabin, warmth still ruled. The stove glowed softly, and the air carried the steady scent of wood smoke and damp wool drying near the fire. Ash and Blaze lay curled together on a folded blanket near the hearth, their small bodies rising and falling in slow, synchronized breaths. Ash, the larger of the two, slept deeply, his dark muzzle resting protectively against his sibling's neck. Blaze twitched occasionally in half-dreams, his paws jerking as if still running through some instinctive chase. Their fur had dried into soft, uneven tufts, and faint warmth had returned to their ears and bellies. They were no longer hovering at the edge of death. They were simply very young and very tired. Ethan woke seated in the wooden chair beside them, his arms folded loosely across his chest, his head tipped forward in uneasy sleep. The first thing he noticed was the absence of sirens and wind. The second was the slow ache blooming through his shoulders and legs, as feeling returned to muscles strained beyond their limits the night before. He straightened carefully, wincing, and watched the puppies for a moment, a quiet relief settling over him as their breathing remained steady. For the first time since his truck had died on the mountain pass, his mind allowed itself to drift from immediate survival to the uneasy space beyond it. He reached for his radio on the table beside him and tested the signal. This time, after a brief wash of static, the dispatcher's voice came through faint but clear enough to confirm what he feared. The upper road was completely closed. Snowplows were working from the town side, but it would take most of the day before the pass near mile 27 reopened. Ethan relayed his position at Samuel's cabin and was instructed to remain where he was until safe travel could be coordinated. The acknowledgement carried relief, but also a subtle weight. He was, for the time being, stranded. Samuel stood at the small counter preparing a simple breakfast of eggs and hard bread, moving with the measured efficiency of a man who had learned long ago how to make do with little. In daylight, his age showed more clearly. Deep lines traced his cheeks and brow, and his hands, though steady, bore the faint tremor of old injuries and time. Yet his posture remained grounded, as if the mountain itself had taught his body how to anchor against weather and grief alike. He glanced at Ethan and nodded toward the stove. "They're stronger this morning," he said quietly. "Cold tried to take them. It failed." Ethan exhaled slowly, realizing how tightly he had been holding his breath since waking. He accepted a mug of coffee without comment and sat at the table, his gaze lingering on the puppies, as if memorizing the fact that they were still here. The daylight revealed the cabin more fully. Its walls were lined with shelves of tools and supplies, each item cleaned and placed with care. Snowshoes hung beside old fishing rods. A row of lanterns waited near the door like silent guardians. On the far wall, partially obscured by hanging coats and a coil of rope, was what Ethan had not yet seen in the darkness. A cluster of framed photographs, their glass dulled by age and smoke. As he sipped his coffee, his attention drifted there, drawn by shapes that stirred an unfamiliar unease. When Samuel stepped outside briefly to check the fuel line and clear accumulating snow from the eaves, Ethan rose from his chair and approached the wall. The photographs were all black and white, arranged not neatly but with the quiet reverence of someone who had placed them slowly over many years. They depicted young men in fatigue standing beside German shepherds at full attention, proud and alert, their handlers' hands resting on strong, disciplined shoulders. The dog's eyes were intense even in stillness, trained to watch, to protect, to trust. Ethan moved along the wall in silence, recognizing the symbols of a world he knew only through second-hand stories and formal reports. Then his breath caught. Near the center of the display, partially hidden behind an overlapping frame, was a face he knew as intimately as his own. Daniel Cole stood in the back row of one photograph, younger, leaner, his dark hair longer than Ethan remembered, a relaxed, unguarded smile tugging at his mouth as he leaned slightly toward the dog at his side. The nameplate beneath the frame was tarnished but readable, Officer D. Cole, K9 handler. The dog beside him, a powerful German shepherd with alert ears and intelligent eyes, sat tall and proud. Valor. For a moment, the cabin seemed to tilt. Ethan reached out and touched the edge of the frame, his fingers trembling. He had not seen his brother's face captured so alive in years. Official reports had reduced Daniel to language stripped of emotion, casualties, operations, objectives completed. This image defied that cold translation. It showed the brother who had taught him to skip rocks across frozen creeks, who had laughed too loudly at his own jokes, who had always chosen the hard path because it was the one that protected others. Ethan's chest tightened, and memory surged like a tide he had kept dammed for too long. Behind him, the door opened. Snow and cold spilled briefly into the room as Samuel returned, his boots heavy with ice. He stopped when he saw where Ethan stood. Silence stretched between them, thick and fragile. Samuel's eyes moved from Ethan's rigid posture to the photograph on the wall. The lines on his face deepened, not with surprise, but with the weary acknowledgement of a truth long carried alone. "You weren't supposed to find that like this," he said at last, his voice low and stripped of its usual rough steadiness. Ethan turned slowly, his eyes wet but sharp. "You knew him," he said. It was not a question. Samuel nodded once. "I trained with him. I was a technical advisor on the range where he worked before the operation." Ethan's jaw tightened. "The operation where he died." The word landed between them like a dropped stone. Samuel's gaze fell to the floor, as if gravity itself had grown heavier in that moment. "Yes." They sat at the table after that, the puppies stirring faintly in their sleep, as the conversation unfolded in careful, painful layers. Samuel spoke without embellishment, his words steady but burdened. He described the Echo Range facility near the border, the joint training exercises that brought federal teams together, the night the mission shifted from controlled drill to deadly ambush. He told of explosives detonated too early, of structures collapsing inward like broken ribs, of chaos where order had reigned seconds before. Daniel had been assigned to rear coverage with his K9. When the first blast tore through the compound, he had chosen not to retreat. He had stayed behind to clear the way for others, guiding his team through smoke and falling debris. Samuel had last seen him standing in a doorway wreathed in dust and fire, shouting for the others to move as the building began to fail. The next explosion had thrown Samuel backward, injured and buried beneath rubble. By the time he crawled free, the rear structure was gone. Daniel and Valor vanished with it. Ethan listened without interruption, his hands clenched tightly around his coffee mug. He had known the official version for years. He had accepted it because he had no other choice. But hearing it spoken by someone who had stood in the same fire cracked something open inside him. "Why didn't you ever come to us?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you tell my parents what really happened?" Samuel's shoulders sagged, as if the mountain itself had finally pressed too hard. "Because I survived," he said. And he didn't. And every time I tried to imagine standing in front of your family, I saw his face instead of mine. The words carried no defense, only confession. Outside, the wind began to rise again, pushing against the cabin walls, as if reminding them that no reckoning remained sealed for long. Ethan stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. The grief he had disciplined for years flared into something hotter and less controllable. "You let us believe he just disappeared into smoke," he said, his voice breaking despite his effort to control it. "You let us bury nothing." Samuel met his gaze, his own eyes rimmed with red. "I didn't let you," he said. "I failed you." The distinction was thin, and both men knew it. Ethan turned away, his chest heaving, and pulled on his coat with stiff movements. Snow had begun again, soft at first, flecking the air like white ash. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped toward the door. "I need air," he said. "I need to walk." Ash stirred at the sound of his movement, lifting his head weakly with a soft, questioning noise. Blaze attempted to rise and failed, sliding back onto the blanket with a frustrated squeak. The sight almost stopped Ethan, but the pressure inside his chest drove him forward. Samuel watched him go without protest, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table as the door closed behind Ethan and the storm reclaimed one of its own. The snow fell again just after dawn, Not in violent sheets like the night before, but in slow, floating spirals that softened the sharp edges of the mountain and blurred the world into layers of pale gray and white. Ethan did not remember how long he walked after leaving the cabin. Time stretched strangely in the storm, each step separated by breath and memory rather than minutes. The cold gnawed through his coat, but it was the heat in his chest that kept driving him forward, anger tangled with grief, questions that had no place to rest. When he finally stopped, his lungs burned and his legs trembled with exhaustion. He leaned against the trunk of a pine tree, closed his eyes, and let the quiet take him. Somewhere behind him, the mountain held its breath. By the time he returned to the cabin, his anger had not vanished, but it had dulled into something heavier and slower. The light inside glowed warm against the fresh snow. Before he reached the door, he heard unfamiliar voices. A truck engine idled nearby. The sheriff had made it through. Sheriff Tom Hale stood beside his four-wheel drive just off the narrow drive, his wide-brimmed winter hat dusted with fresh snow. He was in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a posture that carried both authority and weariness in equal measure. Years in law enforcement had given him a steady calm, but the fine lines around his eyes suggested a man who had learned too many endings to expect easy beginnings. Near him stood Margaret Hill, the owner of the only cafe in White Rock Ridge. She was 55, with silver-gray hair tied low at the nape of her neck, and a round face shaped by laughter and quiet worry in equal parts. She wore a thick wool coat that hung loosely on her smaller frame and held a thermos clutched between gloved hands, as if it were something alive. Margaret had the kind of presence that made people talk without realizing they had begun, not because she asked questions, but because she listened without judgment. Ethan stopped a few steps away from them, surprise flickering across his tired face. "Roads open?" he asked. The sheriff shook his head. "Not fully. We pushed as far as we safely could with the plow. Figured we'd better come check on you before this next band rolls in." Margaret's gaze moved to Ethan's face, lingering for a moment as if reading the strain carved into him overnight. "You look like you haven't slept since last winter," she said gently, her voice wrapping concern in a layer of dry humor. Ethan almost smiled. Inside the cabin, Ash and Blaze lifted their heads at the sound of new voices. Ash remained still and watchful, dark eyes steady. Blaze attempted to rise immediately, wobbling on his paws before tumbling forward in a bundle of impatience. Margaret gasped softly when she saw them. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, kneeling beside them without hesitation. "You found angels in the snow again, didn't you?" Samuel stood, back near the stove, silent, his lined face shadowed by the low light. The sheriff took in the scene with careful eyes, noting Ethan's rigid posture, Samuel's withdrawn stillness, and the way the puppies lay between them like a fragile bridge no one dared to cross too quickly. While the sheriff checked conditions with his radio and Margaret poured steaming coffee into mismatched mugs, the cabin filled with the small movements of life returning to routine. Margaret insisted the puppies be fed properly and set about warming diluted milk, her hands surprisingly skilled for someone whose life revolved around pies and coffee rather than fragile animals. Samuel watched her with quiet approval. Ethan sat near the table, his gaze drifting again to the wall of photographs. The image of Daniel would not release him now that it had been seen. It was Margaret who unknowingly shifted the day's course. As she helped Samuel rearrange a stack of supplies near the back wall, she glanced toward the photographs and tilted her head. "Funny seeing those old pictures again," she said. "Reminds me of that place up on North Summit." Ethan's head lifted instantly. "North Summit?" he repeated. Margaret nodded. "The old K-9 training range. Military used it years ago before everything got reorganized. Place has been empty forever now. Some folks say it's cursed. Some say it's just forgotten." The sheriff snorted softly. "Cursed usually just means no one wanted to take responsibility when they left." Samuel's hand stilled for a moment where it rested against the counter. His eyes flicked briefly to Ethan, then away. The name hung in the room like a key turning slowly in a lock. Ethan felt it deep in his chest, a pull he could not explain with logic alone. "That's where my brother trained," he said quietly. Samuel did not deny it. The sheriff studied both men, his expression shifting with new understanding. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "If that place still stands," he said, "I want to see it." Samuel hesitated, the old weight rising again in his shoulders. "It's not just a building," he warned. "It's what's buried inside it." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "That's exactly why I need to go." By mid-morning, the sheriff cleared limited travel for them to reach the North Summit Service Road. The snowplow would not make it all the way, but the old pickup with chain tires could manage part of the ascent. Margaret insisted on staying behind with the puppies, declaring that someone had to keep them warm and alive while the men went chasing ghosts. She wagged a gloved finger at Ethan. "You come back in one piece," she said. "Those two need you now." The words settled heavier than she knew. The drive up to North Summit unfolded like a slow unveiling of another world. The trees grew sparser as they climbed, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Snow lay thicker here, undisturbed, muffling sound, until even the engine seemed swallowed by the hush. At last, the iron gate emerged from the white, leaning on one broken hinge, its paint eaten away by rust. Faded letters clung to its surface. U.S. K-9 Training, North Summit Range. The sheriff killed the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. The air beyond the gate carried a different silence, one that felt preserved rather than empty. They pushed the gate open with effort, metal protesting with a low, wounded groan. Inside, the compound sprawled in quiet decay. Rows of kennel structures lined a central yard, their wire rusted, their roofs sagging under the weight of years. Chains hung unmoving, frozen in mid-sway, as if waiting for handlers who never returned. Snow had filled the tracks of old paws and boots alike, erasing the lines between animal and human passage. Ethan moved first, drawn forward by something older than memory. He walked slowly along the row of kennels, his boots crunching softly. Samuel followed several steps behind, every movement measured, his gaze burdened by images layered over the present. The sheriff lingered nearer the gate, not out of fear, but from a quiet respect for what was being uncovered between these two men. Ethan stopped abruptly at one kennel. Beneath a sheet of ice on the metal frame, a small rectangular plaque caught his eye. He brushed snow away with trembling hands, rubbing until the letters emerged. Handler, Officer D. Cole, K-9, Valor. The world narrowed to the single line of text. For a moment, he could not breathe. This was not a report or a photograph. This was proof that his brother had stood here, trained here, lived here. Snow fell softly around him, as if the sky itself were listening. Behind him, Samuel lowered his head. "That was his kennel," he said. Valor never liked confined spaces. He tolerated that one better than most. Ethan swallowed hard. A sudden movement at his feet broke the stillness. Blaze and ash were not there, but instinct flared as if they were. The wind stirred loose snow near the base of a nearby flagpole, revealing the faint edge of metal buried beneath. Ethan knelt, digging with bare hands until his fingers closed around a round, mud-stained disc. He lifted it slowly. A dog tag. Valor was etched into its surface, the letters worn but unbroken. Ethan stood with the tag clenched in his fist, his chest heaving. Samuel's voice grew unsteady as he spoke behind him. He told the rest then. The moments after the blast, the shattered command chain, the evacuation under fire. He told of waking beneath debris, of calling Daniel's name into smoke that gave no answer, of searching until ordered to leave or be left behind as well. "I reported everything that could be proven," Samuel said, "but not the part where he chose to stay." The confession did not absolve him, but it no longer hid. Ethan turned slowly, the storm of the last 2 days reshaped, into something quieter and far more dangerous: clarity. "He wasn't just a name on a casualty list," he said. "He stood here, he trained here, he mattered here." His gaze swept across the abandoned range. "And now, this place is nothing but rot and rust." He looked at Samuel again. "That's wrong." The older man's eyes shimmered with something like hope, fragile and unfamiliar. The sheriff shifted his weight, sensing history bending into something new. Snow continued to fall around them, light and steady. Not a burial this time, but a cleansing. And in the quiet heart of North Summit, a purpose began to stir where only ghosts had lived before. Nothing truly alive is ever built in silence. The idea that had stirred among rusted kennels and buried dog tags did not rise fully formed like a miracle. It grew the way all stubborn things grow, through cold hands, tired backs, arguments, setbacks, and the quiet refusal to stop. They called it the Echo Project at first, a name spoken softly, almost shyly, as if afraid the mountain might laugh at the ambition. The North Summit Range had been abandoned for over a decade, claimed slowly by snow, rot, and animal tracks that paid no respect to its past. Roof panels sagged like broken wings. Doors groaned in protest when forced open. Water lines had burst and frozen into twisting blue veins beneath the ground. Yet Ethan returned again and again, even after his patrol shifts, sometimes alone, sometimes with Samuel, sometimes with borrowed hands from the town that came more out of curiosity than conviction. Samuel worked with the quiet precision of someone who had built things in worse conditions. He taught Ethan how to brace beams with scavenged lumber, how to patch roofs well enough to hold through heavy snowfall, how to coax stubborn engines back to life with patience instead of force. Sheriff Hale helped navigate permits, convincing the county to grant temporary use of the land under community development status. It was not a fast process. Files were lost, approvals delayed, objections raised. But Margaret Hill placed a handwritten sign near the cafe register that read, "For the Echo Project, a place for dogs and the people who still carry winter inside." Coins began to appear in the jar first, then bills, then envelopes slipped under the door when the cafe was closed. Blaze and ash grew as the work progressed. By the end of the first months, they were no longer fragile bundles wrapped in blankets by the stove. Blaze's ears stood tall now, his body lean and restless, his energy spilling out in sudden, chaotic bursts that sent snow flying in all directions. He chased shadows, falling branches, drifting flakes, anything that moved. Ash grew broader and heavier, his movements slower but deliberate. He watched before he acted. When Ethan entered the yard, Blaze would race forward with uncontained joy, while Ash followed at a measured distance, eyes steady, waiting for the moment that truly mattered. The two dogs became living symbols of the project itself, impulse and patience, fire and endurance. By midwinter, the first repaired kennel row stood upright again, its wire cleaned and reinforced, its roof newly sheeted against the snow. They received their first transfers from the county shelter, overfilled, underfunded, desperate for space. Dogs arrived frightened, scarred, or sick, many of them bearing the invisible damage of neglect as deeply as the visible kind. Ethan learned to move among them not as an officer, but as a caretaker. He did not rush their trust. He sat on the cold ground with them. He spoke softly. He waited. Samuel observed, quietly, recognizing the same stubborn loyalty in Ethan that he had seen long ago in Daniel. The mountain tested them again, as spring promised to approach, but never quite arrived. One evening, as the sky darkened early beneath heavy cloud cover, the low growl of an unfamiliar engine reached the upper edge of the range. A group of hunters from a nearby town had driven up the service road despite posted warnings. They were loud before they were visible. Laughter carried sharp and careless through the cold air. Their truck pulled into the open ground near the damaged western storage sheds, the ones scheduled for demolition but not yet cleared. They unloaded gear with little regard for boundary lines, their voices echoing off the empty structures like echoes without restraint. By the time Ethan reached them from the lower kennels, they had already begun building a fire pit out of stones stacked directly against an old wooden wall. Ethan approached with controlled authority, identifying himself, and citing the county fire restriction posted below the range. The men argued back, drunk on both alcohol and disregard, waving off the danger with careless confidence. Words escalated. One man laughed and said snow was nature's fire blanket. Ethan knew better. He warned them one last time before retreating to contact the sheriff. The group eventually packed up and left in irritation, their fire reduced to what they believed was nothing more than dead embers. They did not see the glow beneath the ash. They did not listen to the wind. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped. The wind shifted. It began as a smell, faint and almost mistaken for memory, the dry, bitter scent of burning old wood. Blaze sensed it before the humans did. His playful energy snapped into rigid focus, his body stiffening at the edge of the kennel run. He barked once, sharp and urgent. Ash lifted his head, ears forward, rising to his feet without haste but without delay. Within moments, smoke curled from beneath the rotting boards of the western sheds. A single ember, carried by a sudden gust, had found the one place untouched by snow. Fire did not rush at first. It crept. By the time Ethan reached the storage area, flames had already begun climbing the wall like climbing hands. He shouted for Samuel and slammed the emergency alarm mounted near the tool shed. The siren wailed across the range, thin but relentless. Ash and Blaze broke into frantic barking, their voices layering urgency over the rising crackle of flame. Ethan grabbed the nearest hose, dragging it across the frozen ground as Samuel fought to prime the old pump. Water burst through in irregular spurts, half freezing before it even reached the fire. Ethan worked without hesitation, moving closer than was safe, boots slipping on ice, coat already scorched at the hem. Through the smoke, he saw movement in the far kennels. Not all the dogs had been transferred to the new row yet. Blaze and Ash, driven by instinct, stronger than training, had torn free from their enclosure and were racing toward the burning structure. "No!" Ethan shouted, his voice swallowed by the roar. He dropped the hose and ran. Heat slammed into him like a physical force as he reached the kennel door. Flames licked across the roof beams, dropping sparks like burning snow. He kicked the latch open with his full weight and plunged inside, crouched low against the rolling smoke. His vision narrowed to red and shadow. He found Blaze first, the dog tangled in a length of fallen wire, struggling with fierce, panicked determination. Ethan burned his gloved hands, pulling the metal free, hauling Blaze against his chest and driving backward through the doorway into cold night air. Ash was still inside. Without pausing to think, Ethan turned back. The fire had taken the roof corner now. Sections fell inward with a violent hiss as snow on top turned instantly to steam. He found Ash trapped near the back wall, pinned by a fallen beam across his hindquarters. The dog did not panic. He did not cry. He only looked at Ethan, dark eyes steady, even as smoke poured around them. Ethan threw himself against the beam with everything he had left, muscles screaming in protest. It shifted an inch, then two. With a final desperate heave, he freed Ash and dragged him toward the door, just as a section of the roof collapsed behind them in a roar of sparks and embers. They burst into the open air together, both coughing, both alive. The sound of approaching engines cut through the chaos. Sheriff Hale arrived first, followed closely by the volunteer fire brigade from town. Margaret came with them, refusing to stay behind despite every argument made against her. The firefighters fought with methodical fury, battling wind and ice with equal stubbornness. Townspeople formed chains to pass water where hoses could not reach. Snow and flame collided in violent, hissing bursts. For nearly 20 minutes, the outcome teetered between survival and loss. At last, the fire surrendered. One storage structure lay blackened and gutted, but the new kennel row stood untouched. No lives were lost. Sheriff Hale later traced the incident back to the hunters. Their license plates had been captured on a traffic camera at the lower intersection. Charges followed swiftly: reckless endangerment, illegal fire use, destruction of protected property. Accountability came late, but it came. As dawn crept across the range, pale and tentative, Ethan sat on the frozen ground with Ash and Blaze pressed against his sides, both dogs still trembling faintly from shock and cold. His hands were blistered, his coat was scorched, but his chest rose with breath that had not been taken for granted. Samuel stood nearby, soot streaked across his face, watching Ethan with a quiet intensity that held both pride and relief. Margaret approached slowly and placed her hand on Samuel's arm. "They tried to burn it down," she said softly. "And look, it's still standing." Samuel nodded, eyes never leaving the man and the two dogs at the center of the clearing. Because they finally aren't standing alone anymore. Snow began to fall again, light and clean, settling over the charred wood and fresh paw prints alike. The mountain had tested them, and for now, they had answered. One full year passed between the fire and the morning when the new sign was lifted into place. Winter returned as it always did, steady and unafraid, but it no longer found the North Summit Range empty. The words carved into the wood above the gate were simple and deliberate, their edges still rough from Samuel's careful hands. Echo Shelter, for dogs and officers who lost their way. Snow settled lightly into the letters, as if blessing them with silence rather than burial. Beneath that sign, Ethan stood with his hands resting in his jacket pockets, his breath curling into the cold air, watching a world he no longer feared begin again. The shelter was not large, nor polished in the way donations often promised on paper. The main kennel row held only 16 runs, but each one was clean, warm, and alive with sound. A modest training yard extended beyond it, framed with fencing salvaged from the old compound and reinforced with new steel at the corners. The infirmary was a single room attached to the rear of the main structure, built where a storage shed had once stood in ruin. It contained 2 examination tables, a cabinet of supplies, and a single narrow window that let sunlight fall directly across the center of the room each afternoon, as if the mountain itself chose the hour for healing. That room belonged mostly to Elena Myers now. She was 27 years old, tall and slender, with long auburn hair usually pulled into a quick ponytail that never quite tamed the copper curls escaping at the edges. Her eyes were a bright hazel that reflected both intelligence and curiosity, and her movements carried the soft confidence of someone who trusted her own hands completely. Elena had grown up far from White Rock Ridge, in a city where buildings outnumbered trees and winter was measured in slush rather than silence. She came to the shelter after reading a short article in a regional paper about a former patrol officer and an aging K-9 handler rebuilding an abandoned training ground after a winter fire. She had planned to stay 2 weeks. She stayed. Elena's presence changed the rhythm of Echo Shelter in ways no blueprint could have predicted. She brought not only medical knowledge, but ease, an ability to speak to frightened animals with her entire posture rather than her voice. Dogs that froze at the sight of uniforms relaxed at the sound of her footsteps. Hands that trembled at restraint learned to trust the gentle firmness of her touch. Even Samuel, who rarely yielded space once claimed, found himself quietly stepping aside when she entered the infirmary, watching with a half-hidden admiration that surprised him more than anyone. Blaze and Ash had grown into full German shepherds now, their bodies strong and their personalities etched deeply by the lives they had nearly lost and then gained. Blaze moved like an uncontained flame even in adulthood, fast and fearless, his joy explosive and immediate. He became the shelter's natural guide, often placed with new arrivals to draw them outward with his restless confidence. Ash matured into a broad-chested, steady presence, his gaze unwavering, his loyalty not loud but unshakable. He gravitated instinctively toward the people more than the dogs, especially those who arrived with eyes hollowed by loss and silence too heavy for words. Veterans, officers on leave for injury or grief, men and women who carried memories like unhealed fractures. Ash would sit beside them without command, leaning in with quiet weight until something within them softened. Ethan watched it all with a new kind of awareness. He had returned to active patrol months earlier, but his schedule shifted now around the shelter rather than away from it. He still wore the badge, still drove the same snow-chained roads when winter closed in. But the silence that once followed him everywhere no longer ruled his days. He trained the dogs in the yard, not with rigid authority, but with patience learned the hardest way. He organized sessions with the sheriff's office for young deputies, introducing them not only to K-9 discipline, but to the idea that strength was not measured solely by what one endured alone. Slowly, without announcement, Echo Shelter became something else, not merely a refuge for animals, but a place where broken purpose found new form. Samuel aged into his role like a man discovering a different kind of endurance. He no longer woke to an empty cabin, voices carried through the yard by early morning, boots struck boards, radios crackled softly near the fence. He oversaw repairs, adjusted generators, rebuilt what storms tore at. Yet it was not the machines that drew him forward now. It was the people. He sat with new volunteers at the end of long days and spoke little of his own past, letting others fill the space with theirs. Sometimes, late in the evening when the yard fell quiet, he would walk alone to the far edge of the shelter, where the old flagpole from North Summit still stood, refurbished but unchanged, and remain there in silence beneath the stars. White Rock Ridge changed with the shelter in subtle ways. Margaret arrived every Saturday morning, without fail, her truck bed filled with bread, coffee, and whatever small comforts she believed the week had demanded. "I need excuses to drive up here," she always said, pretending she did not know the truth, that the mountain had given her something to protect again. Sheriff Hale began bringing new recruits to the training yard as part of their orientation, watching from the fence as they worked with Blaze and Ash, learning how control and trust were not opposites but partners. A group of high school students started visiting twice a month, taking photographs, editing small videos, telling the story of Echo Shelter far beyond the ridge where it was born. Adoptions followed. Not all dogs stayed, not all people healed in the same way, but none left unchanged. On a late winter afternoon, when the sky carried the quiet clarity that only comes after weeks of heavy storms, Ethan stood at the edge of the yard as Ash lay at his feet and Blaze raced wide circles through melting patches of snow. The valley below had begun to show its first thin lines of green. Frost still lingered in shadows, but the promise of thaw moved steadily beneath it. Ethan's gaze drifted to the wooden post near the gate, where a small plaque had been mounted beside the shelter sign. Daniel Cole, K9 Handler, Valor. His fingers brushed the edge of the metal, as if confirming that the name still belonged to this world. He spoke quietly then, not to the mountain or to memory, but to the air that carried both. "I couldn't bring you back," he said, "but I learned where you stayed." The words did not break him now. They anchored him. Behind him, Samuel's footsteps crunched softly in the snow. The older man stopped beside him, following his gaze to the plaque. "There are men who don't come home," Samuel said, his voice low but steady. "And then, there are places like this that grow because they once stood." Ethan nodded. The yard echoed with the sound of barking and laughter as Elena knelt to encourage a timid new arrival into the open, her voice light and calm. Blaze bounded toward her in unrestrained confidence, circling back to coax the trembling dog forward. Ash remained at Ethan's side, pressing his weight into the back of his leg, as if reminding him that he no longer stood alone in any season. The wind shifted across the ridge, carrying the scent of thawing earth mixed with pine resin and clean snowmelt. The shelter flag stirred above the gate, its fabric snapping once before settling into a steady wave. Winter had not disappeared. It would return again, as it always did. But now it would find footprints already waiting, and lights that did not vanish with the storm. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come through a tired man who refuses to give up in the snow, through two fragile puppies fighting for one more breath, and through hearts that choose to forgive instead of turning away. In our daily lives, we all face winters of the soul, moments of loneliness, fear, loss, or exhaustion, when the road feels too cold and too long. But God walks beside us even then, sending help in ways we may not recognize at first, and teaching us that no one is ever truly alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope. Today, leave a comment to tell us your thoughts and press. Subscribe to support this channel so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, love, and quiet miracles. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And if you believe in the gentle miracles God sends into our lives, please type Amen in the comments.